Wendy is currently the acting director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her research on the Holocaust has resulted in numerous fellowships and awards. She is also the author of a number of publications, including Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and has been translated into 23 languages. And she will speak about it today as well. Please join me in welcoming Wendy Lower.
Okay, good morning. All of you have been, this is such an honor and such a privilege to be invited here to participate in this program. It's not my first time to Toronto, but it's my first time in front of all of you, mostly educators here in Canada. So I really appreciate that you are dedicated to this, are passionate teachers, and they're coming here in January, on the weekend, on a Sunday, to participate in this program. So I just want to acknowledge all the work that you do. I couldn't do the work at the museum without all of you, without all our constituents. And I'm just getting a new appreciation for, I work in a research institute. I'm a scholar, a researcher, and I want to talk a little bit about that because today I'm going to talk about the history of the Holocaust and some particularly startling chapters and recent discoveries. I'm also going to talk a little bit about research, some innovative research that's going on at the museum. And I hope that this is the kind of content that you'll be able to bring back to your classrooms and engage your students in the history in this way. When I think about never forget, my way of never forgetting, or when somebody says to me, remember, is to work through the material. That's what energizes me. The Holocaust Museum, as Elie Wiesel, is a living memorial. What does it mean to be an active rememberer, an active humanitarian? What does it mean to memorialize? It's an activity as such. And I promote as much as I can as a teacher and as a researcher that very activity of learning the history and teaching it and questioning it and not being afraid to ask the big questions and to keep digging and to inspire in our students that kind of curiosity and that commitment to wanting to know, to wanting to get to the bottom of it. Now, there's some humility, obviously, that goes with that because we'll never uncover every story. We'll never find all the answers. But that shouldn't prevent us from the search and the continual search. So I want to talk a little bit about how some of the searching that I've done in my career as an historian has led to new questions, has turned to the world of education, I hope, and how it continues to this day with the various book projects that I'm involved in, teams of researchers that I lead at the museum. So it's a very kind of a personal introduction to what I want to talk to you about today. And I realize that you probably can smell the buffet in the hallway. I don't want to ramble on and on. You've been very patient. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a kind of quick version of Hitler's Furies, just maybe, so you get the main points of the research, of the findings, and some pieces of some of the testimony I think that are really compelling, that I hopefully will stay in your memory and help you in your teaching. And then the second part of my presentation, because I'm apparently wearing two hats here today, would be to talk a little bit about research and its role in education and recent initiatives of the Holocaust Museum in DC. In my work there for the last 2 years, I was really brought on to not only work with these researchers in the archives, but also to work in these initiatives in higher education. A couple of times today, including in our last presentation, we heard questions about what's going on at the university level, what is our commitment at the university level, what strategies can we take to ensure that the Holocaust is being taught in U.S. or in colleges and universities. So I want to talk to you about some of that as well, in terms of the ideas I have for that and some of the steps we've taken in Washington to deal with that challenge. Now, my story, or my experience, I should say, one of the survivors at the museum, 101 years old, Fanny Heisenberg, always reminds us, Wendy, it's not a story, it's an experience. My encounter with the Holocaust and Holocaust research began in the early 90s, and the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and indeed this history became ever more relevant because suddenly the Iron Curtain had fallen and a lot of the materials that had been behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet archives were now accessible. And this was the start of a watershed period of research and a new era of looking at the so-called killing fields. People like Father Dubois suddenly could actually go to these sites and to start to look around for witnesses. Thousands of them he has interviewed to this day, and as we've just heard, a couple thousand mass grave sites that he's uncovered, mostly in Ukraine. And I was a graduate school student, and I had the good fortune of being in the classroom at university level. Now, as a high schooler, of course, I had read Knight and I had read Anne Frank, but it wasn't until I got into graduate school and into university and sat in a seminar room with Professor Richard Brightman, who had just written a book on Heinrich Himmler called The Architect of Genocide, that it really started to make sense. I think that we go from a kind of emotional, working through encounter with the history, get into the college and university level, cognitively, in terms of your maturity. We know this, that this age group from about 18 to 30, when you are independently at the college university, away from your parents, making life choices in terms of your career, reading things like Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, reading German documentation that's been translated. This is when some of these really vexing issues related to the Holocaust, these challenges intellectually, start to sink in, and you start to internalize them into your adulthood in a very significant way. And that's what happened to me. So I started to read these more serious studies and participate in these seminars on the Holocaust, and decided that this was something I wanted to learn more about. The museum was just opening in 1993. As I mentioned, the Soviet Union collapsed. I wanted to have what we call today kind of experiential education by going on an academic travel trip. Many of you have participated in these. You've talked about the March of the Living. I went to Ukraine, and I went to the archives because I had read in a footnote that Heinrich Himmler's headquarters was about 100 miles west of Kiev, and so was Hitler's, his werewolf headquarters. And this was going to be, Ukraine was going to be their utopia, their Aryan utopia for the East, the so-called living space of the East. They were building an Autobahn through there. Hitler said that the Crimea was going to be the Nazi Riviera. And of course, their first step in preparing this territory into a Nazi playground and racially pure utopia was to eliminate their arch enemies, their racial threats, starting with the Jews. And I naively thought that if I went out into these archives in Ukraine and started to rummage around, I might find some captured German documents. I might even find some critical documents having to do with the decision-making around the Holocaust. In the early 90s, the big debate that was raging at the time was, and even deniers were insidiously calling for a Hitler order to be proof of that the Holocaust actually happened. And when were these fateful months? When were these decisions made among the Nazi leadership, Heinrich, Himmler, Heydrich, to embark on a so-called final solution? Well, when I got to Ukraine, to these archives, I didn't find the smoking gun order. You would have heard about that. In fact, I ended up finding a lot of personnel records, a lot of local level kinds of reports. Okay, this is in Zhytomyr and Kiev. These are the field outposts, the colonial outposts of the Reich, and they're writing back and forth to leadership in the headquarters in Berlin about the implementation of orders. And the pressure that they were under as these kinds of colonial governors, commissars, was to report back to their superiors that they had done their job, which is to say that their regions were Judenrein, free of Jews. And once in a while, these reports were rather detailed, but often very perfunctory, like any bureaucratic system. These are Nazi bureaucratic records, and these are ambitious governors who are working towards the Fuhrer and want to get commendations and so forth. So we find things like commendations for a job well done, very short, brief reports that an action was carried out. We heard some of the language on the panel today, this very callous, cold language having to do with the destruction of entire Jewish communities and Jewish families. And what I ended up finding, actually, was reports that placed German women, ordinary German women, in these so-called killing fields, in the outposts of the Reich, of the Nazi Reich in Belarus, in Ukraine, in the Baltics, as secretaries, as nurses, as teachers. And I was really shocked by that because I thought about these areas as a kind of war zone a occupation zone and thought that all the German women were staying home on the front, keeping down the home front and defending the home front while their men, their brothers, their fathers were fighting the war in the east. But in fact, this was a colonial endeavor that the Nazis were embarking on, not merely an occupation, but an actual transformation of those occupied regions into German settlements, and that involved women who were mobilized, as I came to determine, up to 500,000 who circulated in the Eastern Territories. One former kindergarten teacher in Ukraine was told, as she was being brought over the border into Poland, they were briefed by as she recalled after the war, they were briefed by some men in brown uniforms as they crossed the border into the Eastern occupied territory zones. I said, don't be afraid if you hear gunfire. Quote, it was just that this is what the German official told these secretaries and these teachers. It's just that a few Jews were being shot. Now, the literature at the time on women and the Holocaust or women in Nazi Germany really didn't get at the issue of genocide as a full social practice. That genocide involves, on the side of the perpetrators, the entire family, right? The young who are mobilized into the Hitler Youth, who are educated in the Nazi school system, the wives who are comforting their husbands who are in the military and police, they are comforting when they come home and providing that sense of normalcy. And in terms of female perpetration, most of the work was done on female guards, like Ilse Koch, the so-called bitch from Buchenwald, or Hermana Breinsteiner, the mayor from Majdanek. And in this way, they were eroticizing women, and the evil of women was a kind of pornographic, erotic depiction. We didn't see ordinary women in the way that we saw ordinary men in Christopher Browning's work. A lot of the work on the perpetration of the Holocaust focused on men, and to be sure, most of the perpetrators were men. But genocide, as I mentioned, is a social practice. Involves the mobilization of entire societies, 40 million German women, 12 million of them in Nazi Party organizations. Could there be, for instance, I was thinking in my research, a female version of an Eichmann? Was there a female version of a desk murderer, a desk bureaucrat? Well, in fact, there was, Gertrude Slavka, who worked in The Hague and who was in charge of drafting the lists, including the name of the Frank family on that list through Westerbork. And Simon Wiesenthal participated in that trial with Kempner, Robert Kempner, and Otto Frank in Munich in the 1960s when she was brought to trial and remarkably convicted. That was a very rare conviction, and I think it was because Simon Wiesenthal was there. There was a lot of press. It was good. In any case, were there, if you look at the perpetrator portraits of men, the ordinary bureaucrat, the technocrat, the guard, the policeman, the sadist, the eliminationist, anti-Semite, as Daniel Goldhagen called them, I thought, well, let's put women to the test of all these categories and just see. Because while women, if they are not put to this test, they will remain in the female sphere. And as my colleague Ann Taylor Allen, historian, put it, and they will be endowed with innocence of the crimes of the modern state, but at the price of being placed outside of modernity and indeed outside of history itself. Now, I'm looking at the clock, so what I'm going to do is go through some of these slides because my book ultimately focused on 13 women, 13 different biographies. And I chose those biographies because I believe that they best represented the kind of spectrum of participation in the Holocaust across Eastern Europe. Here we have an example of a document that I looked at early on in the 90s, just a great example of how women are involved. In this case, it's a German document, secret, and these women here, Fräulein Hase, Fräulein Grunewald, they're working as secretaries in Riga, and they're being ordered to destroy the documentation as the Germans are evacuating. So German secretaries are involved in the cover-up. They're involved in the destruction of the evidence of the Holocaust, for example. Where do we find these women? Well, they're not going to be in a personnel file that is specifically, other than the camp guards. We have a list of camp guards, about 2,500 from 1944, because they're in uniform. I'm interested in German women who are not in the camp system. I'm interested in German women who were circulating in the occupied territories outside the camp system. There were 4,500 camp guards who were trained, that we have one document. We know there are about 40,000 camps. I think the number of 4,500 is probably low. In any case, I'm interested in how women are brought out into the history of the Holocaust in their everyday lives and in all different capacities as the system, as the machinery of destruction, as Raul Hilberg called it. Because the individuals who were in the camp system are a fraction of those who were involved in the implementation of the Holocaust, both in the deportations, the camp system as a whole, the mass murders, the mass shootings. Half of the victims, at least half of the victims of the Holocaust, perished in ghetto liquidations, mass shootings, lethal injections in the healthcare system, in the euthanasia program. So the magnitude of this is quite large, and as I said, it involved all sectors of society. And for too long, women were not part of this history. So where do you find this, right? Well, there was no one agency for the final solution. In the German system, as Raul Hilberg reminds us, most of the people involved in the Holocaust, with the exception of people like Eichmann, were part-timers. It was part of their work, but not all of it. It was one facet of their work. And so you have to look, especially for women's history, you have to look in all different kinds of sources, which makes it a kind of an interesting challenge and gets back to my first point about the excitement that you can bring into the classroom in helping your students understand the investigation of this and trying to get to the bottom of it. It is indeed a mass crime, and trying to understand all perspectives of it and all facets of it. So we look in photographs. And we see women here. This is Treblinka. This is a group photograph from Treblinka, and there is a woman prominently sitting right in the middle. This is taken at Treblinka, and it just says on the caption, an unknown woman. And here we have another woman with Franz Stangl, who was at Sobibor, and also distinguished himself in the killing centers. And so women are here, but we weren't really delving into why was she there and who was that woman. Ultimately, as I went through these different personnel records and photographs and oral histories, and also conducted oral histories myself in Germany, I estimated that there were about 500,000, as I said, who were circulating in these parts of Eastern Europe. Here, General Government of Poland, Reichskommissariat of Ukraine, the Ostlands or the Baltics. These are German women that I could account for. I'm sure there were many, obviously, non-German women, Romanian women, Hungarian women also involved in this system as a whole. There were about 30,000 women who worked for the order police, 10,000 women who worked in the SS offices, in the SS headquarters, in the German Red Cross as nurses. One of the cases that I came across that was particularly shocking, which actually convinced me to write the book, was that of Erna. She's probably the worst of the perpetrators in the book, although the biggest discovery I found for this history was not so much that women were the worst of the perpetrators and that they were even very numerous. There were very few Erna. The important role that women played was as accomplices, keeping the machinery going, especially as the war dragged on and most men were then sent, able-bodied men were sent into other roles. All women were obligated, especially young single women between the ages of 17 and 25, to perform their labor service. Anything that you see about Nazi propaganda, and this is where it's important in secondary education because people see stuff on the web, youngsters, and they see Nazi propaganda with, the projection that Goebbels wanted us to see of Aryan women, the land of milk and honey, and they've got the child at their breast and so forth. After 1935, most single women in Germany, or most women in Germany, were not pregnant and were not staying home. And the divorce rate actually went up. So there's a huge difference between the projection that we see in Nazi propaganda and the reality of a regime that is engaged in a genocidal campaign and gearing up for a global war. It involved women. And these women I called the lost kind of generation because here's Erna, the perpetrator I studied. Here she is when she was arrested by the Stasi in 1961. There's her mugshot. She confessed to killing 6 Jewish children, and I'll read a section of confession, very rare confession. Here she is in the 1930s, 30 years before. She is very similar to many in her cohort who were born. Most of the perpetrators and witnesses and those in the Nazi system I worked on, born 1920, 1921, 1919, right after the First World War. They're called the lost generation of baby boomers from the First World War. What happens after the First World War? Germany, like the Soviet Union, the US, women get the vote. Suddenly, they become part of a democratic program. They can go, they can vote, they can participate in elections, they can join one of the myriad political parties. They're activated. They feel this sense of liberation. It's also the rise of the modern urban society. They're getting their first paychecks. They're entering into the halls of the modern workplace. They're going to secretarial schools. This is a very, exciting time. You think of the Weimar Flappers, you think of the 1920s, but they didn't have very much experience in the political realm as such. So in many ways, they were mobilized and very excited about these opportunities, but they weren't educated in the way that in a kind of democratic system. The Weimar system was very fragile, and by the time this generation, like Erna, who contributed to the Holocaust, went to school, she was educated in the 1930s through the Nazi system. So she was experiencing the independence of being a kind of liberated woman, but her education was entirely a Nazified education, starting with 10 years old in the Hitler Youth as a girl. So you have this very unusual phenomenon of women who are ready to go and participate in the political process and be active, and they are completely educated by this Nazi system. And I think this picture is a classic. This is from their family's personal photo album when I interviewed the family. She's sitting on the motorcycle, straddling the motorcycle, and the Nazis were all about speed and motorcycle clubs, and her husband was in the motorcycle club. Her husband was an SS officer, and yet she's wearing the Hausfrau apron and she's got her hair pulled back. So it's this very strange mixture of kind of the German classic Hausfrau and the Nazi movement and conforming to that, and the excitement and speed and the ambition and adventure of ultimately of what they said, going east. And here are the nurses being sworn in Berlin. You can see the magnitude of this, their involvement, and here you have a recruiting picture of a young German teacher, 3,000 young German women going to Poland as quote-unquote welfare workers. And this is an example of how the German professions, female professions, are now being perverted and instrumentalized for the war and for these demographic and kind of engineering programs in the East. One of the women I studied very closely was a nurse, Annette Schöcking-Hollmeyer. She's the example to me of the Patriot, the German Patriot, educated, thrown into the kind of killing fields of the East, in this case in Ukraine, and is completely overwhelmed by it, paralyzed by what she's witnessing, and actually goes on after the war as one of the first female judges in West Germany, and is involved in some investigations after the war and denouncing some of her former male colleagues. And I asked her, before you were sent to the East in 1941 as part of the Soviet invasion of the Soviet Union, what did you know? Did people tell you anything? And she said, well, I didn't need to be told why we're at war. There was plenty of propaganda and anti-Semitism, but a journalist in Berlin told her on the eve of her departure, Annette, Russia is no place for you. They are killing all the Jews there. And as she made her way east in the train through Brest-Litovsk with her companion Lily, she was also shocked when two SS men came into the train compartment and started to talk about killing Jews, including a Jewish woman. And I said, well, why did these SS men talk to you? She said, well, Wendy, oftentimes conversations with soldiers got personal fast. They were all men who hadn't been around women for a long time. There were Ukrainian women, of course, but they couldn't talk to them, and they all had an intense need to talk. On another occasion, Annette recalled, I was riding in a truck when all of a sudden the German driver started telling me that in Kazatin, a village southeast of Kiev, he and his colleague had allowed several hundred Jews to go hungry for 2 days before shooting them because the firing squads had been busy working somewhere else. Only after a few weeks of working in this is a soldier's home, a retreat for soldiers, and she's serving them food, and she's listening to all these conversations of these German soldiers, SS and police and Wehrmacht going back and forth and circulating in the area. She wrote to her mother in 1941, November, "Dear Mother, what Papa says is true. People with no moral inhibitions exude a strange odor. I can now pick out these people, and many of them really do smell like blood. Oh, what an enormous slaughterhouse the world is." I made another decision when I wrote this book. I introduced the women in the first chapter without giving away too much about their wartime reactions, because after all, these young women, even the most fanatical, could not have imagined what they would see in the Eastern Territories. Only one had traveled beyond her native Germany, and most had not ventured beyond their hometowns. They underwent their own transformations when they went east, and their ideological commitment and character were severely tested. And this other case, Lita Mayer, now we're moving kind of closer to women who are actually bloodying their hands. Lita Mayer is a classic case of a secretary, a kind of Eichmann in the field. She was the executive secretary to the commissar from Lita, Belarus. And Lita Mayer, again born in 1920, she had training as an accountant, was placed in Lita, which was home to a region of about 12,000 Jews, and 6,000 of them were brought in through the town of Lita and killed there. She was not only an accomplice as this executive secretary to the regional governor, who's this man, Haun Vogel. So this is the regional governor, that's Lita. And they became lovers. And Haun Vogel's entire family was also based in Lita. Lita is near the forests between Vilnius and the Bielski partisans were active in these forests. This is an important example of how a secretary and the relationships of these Germans in the field, killing fields, became, and even sexual relationships and affairs, became kind of intermingled with, mixed up with the Holocaust in some very bizarre ways. Lita Mayer and her colleagues in the Lita office used to go on hunts, recreational outings on Sunday afternoons. And one Jewish survivor who survived one of these outings made it into the courtroom and remembered Lita Mayer. On one Sunday, he said, all the Jews of Lita were called out to go into a nearby forest to clear out the rabbits hiding in the bushes and chase them in the direction of a German hunting party of men and women. And a group of several hundred men were recruited for this job. The Jews were marched down the road to the forest in the deep snow, shaking from cold and fear of what they would encounter. And suddenly a group of winter carriages appeared, including the local commissar, Haun Vogel, and his staff, senior officials, women wearing beautiful fur coats. They were all drunk, lying around their seats in the carriage, hugging and shouting, and their peals of laughter were echoing in the distance. The wild Germans mocked the Jews, laughed at them, and struck those nearby with whips. They aimed their rifles and started shooting at the Jews to the raucous pleasure of the staff. The bullets struck some marchers who moved slowly in the snow and then collapsed in pools of blood. When questioned about this after the war, Lita Mayer stated that she and her colleagues did in fact go on hunting trips, usually on Sundays. Here's Haun Vogel. He was arrested by the Red Army when the Red Army reoccupied and kind of disappeared into the Russian interior, and the family found out that he had been killed in the early 50s. When I interviewed the family, one of the testimonies that I read described in the Jewish workshops the Jews from Lithuania who made their way into the ghetto and were able to get these life-saving certificates of labor, these labor cards, which Lita Mayer issued, by the way. She was issuing these life-saving certificates, these labor cards. And Lita participated in the selection. She pulled people out. Oh, this woman who was in the selection, here we see the picture. Yeah, the sources are unbelievable. It takes a lot of digging. But these photographs I found in Germany, I don't know who this is. That's Haun Vogel. This is a selection in the summer of '42, and the secretary, see the woman standing there, could pull somebody out. She's my personal hairstylist. She didn't finish knitting me a sweater. In this picture, this young Jewish man has been chased. He is about to be executed. Somebody is standing here taking this photo. He's being brought out of this hiding place, and you see the mix of people here. The woman, Commissar Haun Vogel, the policeman. He's going to be brought to the field and publicly hanged and left on display to terrorize the rest of the population. The daughter contacted me after I wrote the book, and these are the love letters. I just got these earlier this year between Lita Lower and Haun Vogel. Lita Lower survived the war. Haun Vogel, the father, didn't. And Lita Lower was brought in and questioned. Orpo 101, Browning's book, there's Vera Volhauf. This is Mid-Jirgis, August 42. They had just participated in the deportations of Jews, and they're having some refreshments that same day. And this is Lita Lower, Haun Vogel's, Lita Lower Meyer's colleague is during these hunting parties. So we can find documentation, a testimony, photographs, and start to corroborate these stories. It turns out that the wives and mistresses of SS men and order policemen were probably, like the nurses in the euthanasia program, the worst of the female perpetrators. And this is the Erna Patriot story that I referred to at the beginning of my talk. Erna, who was arrested in '61, she and her husband Horst were given a plantation, a kind of farm in western Ukraine, as part of the Nazi ideology to de-urbanize these areas into colonial settlements, agricultural settlements. This is a Polish manor. It was a huge social mobility was also part of the story. This was a huge step up for the Patriots to go from a small town near Erfurt to a state like this one here in Galicia. This is from the wartime itself. There's Erna and her family. Their children are there. Again, the entire German family involved in this. This estate, this is in 2010 when I went back to the estate. That's the way it looks today. The estate was placed along the railway lines that led from Lviv, Lvov to Belzec and Sobibor. About 250,000 Jews were deported from Western Ukraine to these two killing centers in 1942 and 1943. And in 1943, and even in late 42, Jews, the trains would move and stop at this one railway station on their estate, near their estate, and Jews would break out of the boxcars and seek refuge on their farm, in their barns, in their house. And this is how the Holocaust then intersected directly with Erna and Horst Patriot. In Erna's confession, I want to read a little bit from this, just because it will give you some insight into her mindset and her post-war confession, her rationale for what she did. The interrogator asked Erna, September 1961, about the children she confessed to shooting, the 6 Jewish children. And the interrogator from the East German system, this is, said, "Erna, where did these children come from?" And she replied, "I do not know exactly where they came from, but I assume that these were children who broke out of the boxcar. At this time, all remaining Jews who were in several camps were being transported to the extermination camp. In these transports, often and especially at the train station, Jews would break out and try to save themselves. These Jews were all naked, so that the Ukrainians and Poles living in the area could be distinguished from them. These Jews were easy to recognize. The Jewish children whom I shot wore only clothing shreds or were naked, so I assume that these were the Jews who had broken out of one of these transports." "Why did you shoot the Jewish children?" Erna answered, "In those times, as I carried out the shootings, I was barely 25 years old, and I was still young and inexperienced. I lived only among SS men who carried out shootings of Jewish persons. I seldom came into contact with other women, so that in the course of this time I became more hardened. I did not want to stand behind the SS men. I wanted to show them that I, as a woman, could conduct myself like a man. I wanted to prove myself to the men. Besides, in those days in this region, everywhere one heard that Jewish persons and children were being shot, which also caused me to kill them." Then the interrogator said, "How could it be possible that you, yourself, as a mother of 2 children, could shoot innocent Jewish children?" Erna replied, "I am unable to grasp at this time how in those days that I was in such a state as to conduct myself so brutally and reprehensibly, shooting Jewish children. However, earlier, I had been so conditioned to fascism and the racial laws, which established a view towards the Jewish people. As it was told to me, I had to destroy the Jews, and it was from this mindset that I came to commit such a brutal act." Horst, her husband, who was responsible for killing many more, was given the death penalty and guillotined in 1962, and Erna got a life sentence. She was released in 1992 after the wall came down for health reasons, and she died in July 2000. To conclude, how do we make sense of the cruelty and extreme violence of ordinary German men and women? And in my book, I go into some various theories, Cesare Lombroso, Sigmund Freud, Franz de Waal, but basically agree with James Waller that it is our environment and social conditioning that brings out this capability, and it is a minority who go on to do the extreme killing. One of the state prosecutors I interviewed, who investigated 25,000 suspects, indicted 159 from Nordrhein-Westfalen between 1965 and 2000, said he didn't encounter anyone who could be described as psychopathic. He said the individuals were not insane. It was the Nazi system that was crazy. They were law-abiding citizens in the new democratic Germany. They were successful chameleons. After reading thousands of pages of wartime documents, court records, and testimonies, I decided to visit that wartime crime scene where Erna Petrie's trial had illuminated the sketches and photographs of the plantation in western Ukraine. I was not sure what I would find there. I did not know if the place actually existed or what I would do once I got there. And this is a photograph from when I went in 2010. Found the location on the map, and it was a short taxi trip from the Lviv heading north. We drove paralleling the same railway lines that had taken hundreds of thousands of Polish and Ukrainian Jews to the gassing facilities of Belzec and Sobibor. We turned down the same road that Erna Petrie took that fateful day when she spotted Jewish boys who had fled from the boxcar. We entered the long driveway leading to the manor, which had changed from a stately home to a decrepit structure overgrown with weeds. The porch was 2 pillars with a sagging middle, standing precariously on cinder blocks. Given what I knew, the place felt haunted, but to the poor elderly Ukrainians who eked out an existence there, it was home. The gilded ironwork on the terrace where Patriot had served cake and coffee was rusted and flaking like brittle bones crumbling at the joints, and clean laundry was hung there to dry. The women living there immediately appeared when they saw us, strangers in city clothes with cameras, stepping out of a taxi. We walked a few hundred meters in the direction of the location that was described in the court record as the murder site. It was a strip of forest along a gully that divided 2 fields. I was momentarily distracted by the scene around me, which was picturesque and peaceful. Fields were being harvested by threw their garbage there, plastic bags, rags, and booze bottles. Or perhaps the rains had carried the waste into this crevice. This gully is not the only site in Ukraine where mass graves from the Holocaust, the bones and often personal possessions of Jewish victims, lie a few meters below a surface covered with weeds, empty bottles, and other refuse. I stood there, meditating, praying, and thinking about what had happened there, and what those frightened Jewish children who whimpered when Erna Petrie drew her pistol might have achieved had they lived. I apparently stood there too long. A Ukrainian peasant with his wool-capped flannel shirt, threadbare jacket, and mended pants accosted me. It was time for me to go. In many ways, Hitler's Furies and the research that we do on the Holocaust is about how we fail to reckon with the past, not so much as a historical reconstruction, a morality tale, but as evidence of a recurring problem in which we all share responsibility. What are the blind spots and taboos that persist in our retelling of events, in memoirs, and in our national histories? Why does this history continue to haunt us, generations and many miles removed? The consensus in Holocaust and genocide studies is that the systems that make mass murder possible could not function without the broad participation of society, and yet nearly all histories of the Holocaust leave out half of those who populated that society, as if women's history happened somewhere else. It is an illogical approach and puzzling omission, and the dramatic stories in Hitler's Furies reveal the darkest side of female activism, and they show us what can happen when women are mobilized for war and acquiesce in genocide. These are some memoirs that German women have written recently. The timing on this, the possibility of the history emerged more recently because of the archives, because German women were writing more about their war experiences. One of the secretaries who was acquitted twice. Okay, now let's take a breather. We only have a few minutes left, and I just want to briefly show you a little bit about education from a research perspective. I hope that my presentation was also kind of an example of what we model at Claremont McKenna College, which is the teacher-scholar model, and the passion of teaching that can come through the research, through the source material. When one asks what the role of scholarship is in securing and improving Holocaust education, I say everything. I say it's foundational and it's necessary. If there is no one teaching the Holocaust in a college or university, think about it, if it's just not being offered at all, I believe that the field will dry up. I believe that we will not have the level of expertise in the institutions we've invested in, including the Holocaust Museum, that level of knowledge. I don't think we'll be able to maintain the commitment to the excellence and the rigor that can be brought to bear on the sources that we've collected, on the collections that we are conserving right now and taking care of. It's absolutely vital for us to be offering it in the university classroom and supporting a kind of research infrastructure, because this is where the new questions come up. This is how it becomes, this is the vitality of it, the vibrancy of it, the discovery process, what makes it a living memorial, the activity. This is how the Mandel Center, the logic flow of the program I've been directing, the acquisition of the material. There are two things that the museum is committed to that are foundational: the scholarship and rescuing the evidence and conserving and caring for the evidence, the record of the Holocaust, to preserve that into the future as this constant source of research and discovery and knowledge. So here you can see that piece of it. Work in 58 different countries. Just this year we acquired 2.5 million records, and I can talk to you about some of those new collections. It's very exciting. The French just declassified a lot of their material. It's going to open up a whole new stream of research on collaboration. Collaboration is going to move back west, to where it started, to France. We can see what happened in France when the Americans invaded, the Allies invaded, and the Canadian and the British. An incredible story, 1944-45. The scholarship in the museum, the residency program, requires that kind of immersion, that kind of reflection, that kind of exchange, and all those resources. Big publication projects, monographs, group publications, the encyclopedia, which of camps and ghettos, which got online. We're also trying to make things more accessible digitally. Indiana University Press agreed to let us put that online. You can get it now at the museum and download it for free instead of spending $200 on the book. And search it and find out the local histories of all these sites, some 40,000 sites. This requires 14 different languages. No single scholar can do something like this, that kind of institutional commitment. Training the faculty at colleges and universities in these seminar programs that we have 3 times a year. Obviously educating youth in this case, in my unit, 18 to 30-year-olds, so graduate students, undergraduate students. And finally, the big outcome is to what extent do you change public awareness and foster public discussions and discovery on that grander scale. That's really when you feel like, if you have a measurable outcome, to use the language of all the lingo, that's when you've kind of hit it. But it involves all of this kind of commitment and this kind of activity. We are in the digital age, which means accessibility of material and opportunity, and big data, which is also very exciting. The International Tracing Service, 200 million pages of documentation, 30,000 personal effects in their collection. What do we do with all that big data? What do we do with the big data of the Shoah Foundation testimonies, some 50,000 testimonies? Do we get down to the micro level and focus on individual stories? Yes, because that gets at individual experience. But as scholars, what can we do in terms of determining what that data shows us more writ large, the bigger patterns of experience? We cannot lose sight of what is irretrievable. I was just I'm working on a new book right now about family, and I was working on the International Tracing Service, the Central Tracing Bureau, and thinking about the victims who emerged from the DP camps or from the forests and ghettos of Eastern Europe, who made their way to occupied Germany, who were able to, or those who had left in the 30s, those who were able to make inquiries about their loved ones, about their family members. And then it dawned on me, and the number was something like 200,000 at that time, in the aftermath of the war. What about the missing? What about the entire families where there was no inquiry? We look at those databases and we get into the habit of putting in a name and we put in a location. It's almost like a one-armed bandit, slot machine. Boom, did I get a hit? Did I get a hit? Did I get a hit? Google, did I get a hit? Did I get a hit? And we don't get a hit, we assume it doesn't exist. I think it's really incumbent on us, it's really, really important for us to think about the irretrievable and the scale and the proportion of those who died and who are not in those systems. How do we find them? What kinds of innovative techniques can we use to find those missing and to try to uncover their stories? Thank you very much.